Hello everyone, welcome to today's lecture on invasive species. And I like the idea of invasive species. I've chosen a picture here of two different species of swans. One species is native to Europe and has become invasive in the Great Lakes region. And the other is the species that is native to the Great Lakes region but was wiped out and has recently been restored to the Great Lakes region. So the one on top is called a mute swan, has an orange beak, and is invasive. And the one on the bottom is a trumpeter swan with a black beak. So today's learning goals, we're going to try to focus on what invasive species are and how they can cause harm. We're going to apply different ecological concepts to invasive species like food webs and trophic cascades. And then finally, what we're going to do with the second lecture and the in-class assignment is look at the Great Lakes as an ecosystem and study how invasive species have altered the Great Lakes ecosystem. To start off with, a lot of times I'd like to introduce a scientific expert in the field, and this is Dr. Brian Roth, a very good friend of mine who's in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, and he's the world's expert on Great Lakes invasive crayfish. So there are several species of crayfish that are invasive in the Great Lakes. His research, there's a project on red swamp crayfish, which are the kind that people eat in crawfish stew and so on. And then he does a study on diets of native and non-native predator fish in the Great Lakes. And here he is holding an invasive species, the king salmon that he caught on the Betsy River. So what is an invasive species? So invasive species are non-indigenous species whose introduction does or is likely to cause harm. That can be environmental or economic health or harm to human health. And this is a legal definition. What they mean by non-indigenous is a species that was not found in the area in historic times, and likely its introduction has something to do with humans, was aided by humans or aided by humans' alteration of the ecosystem. Are invasive species always non-native? So we're going to focus on species that are not native when we talk about invasive species, but there are some cases where an indigenous species becomes invasive when humans alter the landscape, but we are going to ignore that possibility for today's lecture. So let's look at some non-native invasive species and what happens. So when a species is introduced into an area, it really is only about 1% of those species that is brought in will survive and start to propagate on its own. So it's not like every species that happens to get to North America establish itself in North America. Many species don't. But those that find success are finding that there's an absence of limiting factors. So there's a lot of food, there's a lot of habitat. A lot of these species are very adaptable to disturbance because humans have disturbed a lot of the habitat. They can be aggressive species, more aggressive than the competitors that would be filling a similar niche, or they're filling a niche that is more or less empty. And then as they start to dominate that niche, they will often spread into other niches and start to compete pretty heavily with other species. So let's look at a few species in North America and them their invasive status, as well as the species in Australia. But one of the most important species in North America in terms of birds, one of the 10 most abundant bird species in North America is the European starling. And so the European starling ended up in North America because somebody had the brilliant idea that we should have all the birds in New York Central Park that are found in Shakespeare's plays. So somebody introduced 100 European starlings to New York in 1896, and since then they have expanded, and there are greater than 200 million European starlings now in the United States, and their range has expanded pretty rapidly over that time. They are very aggressive. They exclude other species from things like nest cavities, and have obviously found great success in the United States. Now that was an introduction kind of on a whimsical note of let's recreate Shakespeare's plays. In Australia, there was a beetle that was causing A lot of damage to sugarcane. So as a grub, the early larval stage of this beetle fed in the sugarcane and caused a lot of damage to sugarcane. So scientists had the idea, let's bring a species from Central America that we know eats insects and introduce it into Australia, and it will control these bugs. So they brought over a species called the cane toad. And the cane toad is the largest toad species. They can weigh up to 2 kilograms, so 4.5 pounds. They can get very large. And they do eat insects, but what they found was, unfortunately, they don't eat these insects, but they eat lots of other insects, and they spread all over Australia. There are more than 200 million cane toads in Australia. These have a toxic gland on their cheek that can lead to poisoning of pet animals when they grab them. And you can see how large these organisms can get. So they've become a major pest in Australia after an intentional introduction. Another intentional introduction is that we have house cats in the United States. And house cats in some cases become barn cats, and barn cats become wild feral cats. And they find that house cats that are let out of the house and feral cats in the United States annually will kill between 1.3 and 4 billion wild birds and between 6.3 and 22.3 billion mammals. So, and many cats have become feral and invasive, and it really is a very serious problem. So the recommendation is that if you have a pet cat and you let it outdoors, that you put a bell around its neck so it's unable to sneak up and kill the native bird species. So let's look at some of the reasons that we've introduced species in the past, and one is recreation. And when we get to the Great Lakes, there have been a few species introduced into the Great Lakes for recreational purposes. But some species, the red deer in New Zealand, the ringneck pheasant in North America, many of you have seen this species not knowing that it's actually not native to the United States, it's native to China. And then the rainbow trout that's native to the western United States but has been introduced into the Great Lakes and into lots of other locations because people like to fish for them. They're brought in as ornamental species and barrier plants. So baby's breath that's popular in bouquets has become invasive in some areas. Salt cedar that was brought in as an ornamental plant for people's yards has escaped into some of the ecosystems in the southwestern United States. Or they could be brought in as for erosion control, such as the multiflora rose was in the Australian pine. Biological control, so this beetle here was brought in to control purple loosestrife, which was an invasive plant species. And this is a case where it actually worked to help control the spread of this invasive plant species that was taking over wetlands throughout the Midwest. And a lot of times they're brought in for production purposes. So Scots pine is often used in Christmas tree plantations, for example, and in producing pine forests. So those are the reasons that things are brought in. So how does a species become invasive, though, is the next thing we want to think about. So it's part of a 5-step process. First, the organism has to be transported or transport itself in a few cases to the new habitat, the new ecosystem. Once it's there, the introduction occurs. It may be, in the case of the Florida Everglades and the Burmese pythons that are there, somebody had pet pythons and they decided, well, we don't want to keep them indoor anymore. I'll just release it into the wild. It's too big to take care of. And those took over the Florida Everglades after that introduction. Establishment, so the species starts to become established and become a major part of the ecosystem. Spread, and then the impacts start to arise. And what we find is that species like the European starling introduced earlier can have pretty significant impacts on other bird species, for example, because of their sheer numbers. So potential impacts of invasive species. One key one is that they compete with native species. So if you take an invasive species and bring it in, maybe it fills a partially empty niche, but it also will often compete with native species. They tend to then dominate ecosystems in some cases, and you get cascading impacts in food webs. So shown at the right here is a food web of the Arctic ecosystem, and if an invasive species was brought in and it impacted one of these species, then it could impact another species. So that would be an example of a cascading impact in a food web. So what I want to talk about as a concept now is trophic cascades, and this is where you have this cascading impact on a food web. So this now we're going to not talk about an invasive species, but we're going to talk about a native species that was reintroduced. And this is Yellowstone National Park and the gray wolves of Yellowstone National Park. So up to the 1920s, wolves were present in Yellowstone, and when Europeans first arrived in North America, they were very common in Yellowstone. They were hunted to extinction, but in 1995, they reintroduced them into the park. And one of their prey species is the elk, shown here. And they had direct impacts on the elk, but they also had impacts on many more species. So what they found was that there was a trophic cascade where the wolves had direct impacts on elk and also on coyotes. But by impacting the elk, they had an impact on the woody plants that the elk ate. And so let's think about that impact. If wolves come in and they reduce the population of the elk, what would happen to the population of the woody plants? Well, fewer elk feeding on the woody plants should logically lead to an increase in woody plants. Well, that led to more berry production. It also led to less erosion in the rivers. It created trees that beavers could harvest. It created nesting sites for birds. And those things then had further cascading impacts. So the berry production led to more food for bears, and so on. And so there were a lot of cascading effects of the wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone. So we're going to learn more about wolves and their impacts on ecosystems in a lecture next week that will focus on wolves in the Isle Royale ecosystem. Now, you have interactions in a food web, you have some direct interactions, so you might think that the presence of wolves was negative for grizzly bears, for example, because the wolves were eating some of the prey of the grizzly bears. But what they found was the wolves had a much more positive impact on the woody plants and therefore the berry production that then had a positive impact on the wolves. So even though you see the wolf and the bear as competitors here, overall there's been a positive impact of wolves on bears once they were reintroduced into the ecosystem. Okay. What do we do about invasive species? So removal of invasive species is important. So we have prevention and early detection, assessment of the invasive likelihood, and then management and removal are kind of the steps. And if we can detect species early, we can get them before they become really established. That's the best time to try to address invasive species. So in the next part of lecture, after you take a short quiz here, we'll have a lecture on food webs in the Great Lakes and the impacts of invasive species on those food webs. So that'll be after your short quiz, and we'll return to lecture then.